The mess hall at Camp Pendleton buzzed with the usual chaos of dinner time. Hundreds of Marines filled the long tables, their voices creating a steady hum that echoed off the concrete walls. Steam rose from the serving trays as kitchen staff ladled out portions of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans to the endless line of hungry soldiers. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood quietly in line, her slight frame barely noticeable among the towering Marines surrounding her. At 5'4", she often disappeared in crowds like this. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and she wore the same desert camouflage utilities as everyone else. To any casual observer, she looked like just another junior enlisted Marine grabbing dinner after a long day of training. But appearances could be deceiving. Sarah had spent the last 15 years climbing through the ranks of the most elite special operations units in the military. What started as a young woman's determination to prove herself had evolved into one of the most decorated careers in naval special warfare. She had led missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations across 3 continents. Her chest bore ribbons that told stories most people would never hear. Bronze stars, Purple Hearts, and commendations that spoke of courage under fire and leadership in the darkest moments. Tonight, however, she was simply tired. Her SEAL team had just completed a grueling 3-week training exercise in the Mojave Desert. The kind of training that pushed even the most hardened operators to their limits. They had practiced everything from desert warfare tactics to urban combat scenarios, all while carrying full gear in temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees. The exercise had been designed to test their new integration protocols. Sarah's team was part of an experimental program that brought together SEALs, Marines, and other special operations forces under unified command structures. It was cutting-edge military doctrine, and Sarah had been handpicked to lead the initiative because of her unique background and proven ability to work across service branches. As she moved through the line, Sarah's mind wandered to the debriefing scheduled for tomorrow morning. There would be after-action reports to file, lessons learned to document, and recommendations to make for future training cycles. The success of this exercise could influence how special operations units work together for years to come. The serving area was cramped, with barely enough room for 2 people to pass each other between the steam tables and the condiment station. Sarah reached for a dinner roll from the breadbasket, her movements economical and precise, habits ingrained by years of operating in tight spaces where every motion mattered. That's when Private First Class Jake Morrison decided to make his presence known. Jake was everything Sarah wasn't. 6'2" of muscle and bravado, fresh out of infantry training and convinced that his size and loud voice made him important. At 19 years old, he had never seen combat, never led troops, and never been tested by anything more challenging than basic training. But in his mind, he was already a warrior, and he felt entitled to respect he hadn't yet earned. He had been watching Sarah move through the line, and something about her quiet demeanor irritated him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself with confidence despite her small stature. Maybe it was because she didn't seem impressed by the loud conversation he had been having with his buddies about their latest training exercise. Or maybe it was simply because he was young, stupid, and looking for someone to push around to make himself feel bigger. Jake had been complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the quality of the food, the temperature in the barracks, and pretty much everything else he could think of. His friends encouraged his behavior with nervous laughter, not because they found him funny, but because they were afraid to become his next target. As Sarah reached for a second roll, Jake decided to escalate his evening entertainment. "Hey, short stuff!" he called out, his voice carrying easily over the dining hall noise. "You gonna eat all that bread? Some of us actually work for our food around here." Sarah paused, her hand still extended toward the basket. She had heard comments like this before, too many times to count. Early in her career, she had learned that responding to every ignorant remark would leave her with no energy for anything else. She usually chose to ignore such behavior, knowing that her actions and results spoke louder than any words. But Jake wasn't finished. Emboldened by what he interpreted as weakness, he stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. The Marines around them began to take notice, sensing that something was about to happen. Conversations quieted as heads turned toward the developing confrontation. "I'm talking to you," Jake continued, his voice getting louder. "Didn't they teach you manners in whatever paper-pushing unit you came from? When a real Marine is talking, you listen." Sarah slowly turned to face him, her gray eyes calm but alert. She had dealt with bullies before, in training, in combat zones, and unfortunately, sometimes within her own ranks. The key was to assess the situation quickly and respond appropriately. Escalation was rarely the right answer, but sometimes it was the only answer people like Jake understood. "Is there a problem, Marine?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice steady and controlled. Jake laughed, a harsh sound that drew more attention from nearby tables. "Yeah, there's a problem. The problem is, we've got people in here who don't belong, taking up space and eating food meant for real warriors." The mess hall was getting quieter now as more Marines stopped their conversations to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, recognizing that Jake was way out of line. Others seemed curious about how this would play out. A few appeared to be enjoying the entertainment. Sarah's team members were scattered throughout the hall, having arrived at different times after completing their individual equipment checks and reports. None of them were close enough to intervene quickly, and Sarah preferred it that way. She had never needed anyone to fight her battles, and she wasn't about to start now. "I suggest you return to your meal," Sarah said, still maintaining her calm demeanor. There's no need for this to go any further. But Jake had committed himself now. With dozens of Marines watching, backing down would mean losing face, and his pride wouldn't allow that. He took another step closer, now standing directly in front of Sarah, using his height advantage to loom over her. "Or what?" he sneered. "You gonna tell on me? Run crying to your supervisor? Let me guess. You're some kind of administrator, right? Maybe a cook? I bet you've never even seen real action." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had more combat experience than probably half the Marines in the mess hall combined. She had led teams through firefights in Fallujah, coordinated helicopter extractions under enemy fire in Afghanistan, and planned operations that had saved countless lives. But she also understood that her accomplishments meant nothing to someone like Jake, who only respected what he could see and understand. Sarah set down her tray on the nearby counter, the action deliberate and controlled. The movement caught Jake's attention, and he misinterpreted it as preparation to leave. "That's right, run along," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is what happens when they start letting anyone wear the uniform. Standards just keep getting lower." That's when Jake made his biggest mistake. As Sarah turned back to face him, he placed his hand on her shoulder and gave her a hard push toward the exit. "Go on, get out of here. This mess hall is for real Marines." The push wasn't gentle. It was meant to humiliate and intimidate. Sarah stumbled slightly but kept her balance, her training automatically engaging as her body prepared to respond to a physical threat. The mess hall fell completely silent now, with hundreds of eyes focused on the confrontation. Jake's friends suddenly looked very uncomfortable. What had started as their buddy showing off had just crossed a line into assault. Putting hands on another Marine was serious business, regardless of rank or gender. Even the Marines who had been enjoying the show now realized this had gone too far. Sarah straightened slowly, her mind racing through options. She could report the incident through proper channels. Jake would face disciplinary action, possibly a court-martial. She could walk away and let cooler heads prevail. Or she could handle this the way it would be handled in the field, where respect was earned through demonstration rather than explanation. The choice was made for her when Jake, apparently feeling that his first push hadn't made enough of an impression, reached out to grab her again. "I said move along, little girl. Don't make me—" Sarah's response was swift and decisive. Years of hand-to-hand combat training kicked in as she grabbed Jake's extended wrist, twisted it at precisely the right angle, and used his own momentum against him. The larger Marine found himself spun around and bent forward, his arm locked behind his back in a position that made any movement painful. The entire maneuver took less than 3 seconds. Jake grunted in surprise and pain, suddenly finding himself completely immobilized by someone half his size. He tried to struggle, but any movement only increased the pressure on his twisted arm and shoulder. "Let me go," he demanded, his voice now higher-pitched with pain and embarrassment. Sarah leaned close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You have 2 choices, Marine. You can apologize for putting your hands on me, or you can explain to your commanding officer why you assaulted a fellow service member in front of witnesses." The mess hall remained silent, everyone waiting to see how this would end. Jake's friends looked mortified. probably already imagining the paperwork and investigations that would follow if this incident was reported. Jake's pride warred with his common sense. The pain in his arm was getting worse, and he was beginning to realize that he had seriously miscalculated his opponent. But apologizing in front of all these Marines would be humiliating. "I don't know who you think you are," he hissed through gritted teeth, "but you just made a big mistake." Sarah increased the pressure slightly, causing Jake to gasp. "The mistake was yours, Marine. You have 5 seconds to decide how you want this to end." Around them, Marines began to whisper among themselves. Word was spreading quickly through the mess hall that something significant was happening. Cell phones appeared as people began recording, though most were smart enough to keep their devices concealed. Jake's face was turning red from both pain and embarrassment. He could feel the eyes of every Marine in the hall on him, watching him be dominated by someone who barely came up to his shoulder. His carefully constructed image as a tough guy was crumbling in real time. But Sarah wasn't finished teaching her lesson. With her free hand, she reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out her military identification card. Still maintaining her grip on Jake's arm, she held the ID where he could see it. "Read it," she commanded quietly. Jake squinted at the card, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. The name Sarah Mitchell meant nothing to him, but the rank designation sent a chill down his spine. Commander. Not sergeant, not lieutenant commander. That put her several ranks above anyone he had expected to encounter in an enlisted mess hall. But it was the unit designation that made his blood run cold. Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The most elite SEAL team in the entire military. The unit that only existed in whispered rumors and classified briefings. Jake's struggles ceased entirely as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He hadn't just picked on some random Marine. He had assaulted a Navy SEAL commander. Someone who could probably kill him in a dozen different ways without breaking a sweat. "Do you understand now?" Sarah asked, still maintaining her grip but reducing the pressure slightly. Jake nodded frantically, no longer caring about his image or his pride. All he wanted was to get out of this situation with his career intact. Sarah released him and stepped back, allowing him to straighten up slowly. Jake rubbed his sore arm and shoulder, his face flushed with embarrassment and the dawning realization of how badly he had miscalculated. "Apologize," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the silent mess hall. Jake looked around at all the faces watching him. Some showed sympathy, others disappointment, and a few displayed barely concealed amusement. But all of them were waiting to see if he would do the right thing. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, barely audible. "Louder," Sarah commanded, "so everyone can hear." Jake straightened his shoulders and spoke more clearly. "I'm sorry, Commander. I was out of line." Sarah nodded once, acknowledging his apology. "You're dismissed, Marine." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He quickly gathered his belongings and headed for the exit, his friends trailing behind him like embarrassed puppies. The mess hall remained quiet until they were completely gone, then erupted in a buzz of excited conversation. Sarah picked up her tray and continued through the serving line, as if nothing had happened. But word of the confrontation was already spreading beyond the mess hall, carried by text messages and phone calls to friends throughout the base. By morning, everyone at Camp Pendleton would know that a SEAL commander had just taught a lesson in respect to a loudmouth Marine. And for Sarah Mitchell, that was exactly the reputation she needed as she prepared for the next phase of her mission. The following morning arrived with the sharp blast of reveille echoing across Camp Pendleton. Sarah had been awake for 30 minutes already, a habit formed through years of military service where being late meant mission failure. She sat at her small desk in the temporary quarters assigned to visiting officers, reviewing the intelligence briefings that had arrived overnight. The documents spread before her told a story that few people were cleared to know. Terrorist activities had been increasing along the Mexican border, with evidence suggesting a highly organized network was planning something significant on American soil. Intelligence agencies had intercepted communications mentioning a major operation scheduled for the following month, but the details remained frustratingly vague. Sarah's SEAL team had been brought to Camp Pendleton as part of a joint task force designed to address this emerging threat. The previous 3 weeks of desert training hadn't been routine exercises. They had been preparation for a mission that could determine the safety of thousands of civilians. A sharp knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called. sliding the classified documents into a secure folder. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped into the room, his weathered face showing a mixture of respect and curiosity. At 45, Rodriguez had served in 3 wars and commanded the respect of every Marine under him. He was also the senior enlisted advisor for the Joint Task Force, which made him one of Sarah's key allies in the complex military hierarchy. "Commander Mitchell," he said, snapping to attention, "I wanted to speak with you about last night's incident." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat, Master Sergeant. I assume word has traveled." Rodriguez settled into the chair with a slight smile. "Ma'am, by 0600 hours, every Marine on this base knew that a SEAL commander had put PFC Morrison in his place. The story's probably reached San Diego by now. And how is Morrison handling his newfound fame?" "Not well, Commander. He's been getting quite a bit of grief from his squad mates. Turns out being publicly embarrassed by someone half your size doesn't enhance your reputation much." Rodriguez paused, his expression growing more serious.
"But there's something else you should know." Sarah leaned back in her chair, recognizing the tone. Rodriguez had information that went beyond simple barracks gossip.
"Morrison's been asking questions," Rodriguez continued, "specifically about you and your team. He's been trying to figure out exactly who he tangled with last night, and some of his queries have reached people who are curious about why a SEAL team is conducting operations at a Marine base. This was concerning but not unexpected. Military bases were notorious breeding grounds for rumors and speculation. When elite units appeared somewhere they weren't normally stationed, people noticed and began connecting dots that sometimes led to classified information." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. "Basic stuff mostly, what unit you're from, how long you've been here, what kind of training you've been doing." Most people don't have answers, but Morrison's been persistent. He seems to think that embarrassing him somehow damages his reputation, and he's looking for leverage. Sarah considered this development. Morrison was clearly too immature and inexperienced to understand the dangerous game he was playing. Asking questions about classified operations, even inadvertently, could result in serious consequences for everyone involved. Has he approached anyone with clearance? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. His company commander is Captain Williams, good officer, but he's been asking his own questions about the Joint Task Force. If Morrison brings his complaints to Williams, things could get complicated. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Captain Williams was indeed a good officer, which meant he would follow proper channels if he suspected security breaches or unauthorized operations. That could mean investigations, paperwork, and delays that the mission couldn't afford. "I'll handle Morrison," Sarah decided. "In the meantime, I need you to do something for me." Rodriguez straightened slightly, recognizing the shift to operational planning. "Yes, ma'am. I want you to identify every Marine in Morrison's unit who might have clearance for classified briefings. Also, find out who else has been asking questions about my team's presence here. We need to know if we're dealing with simple curiosity or something more serious." "Understood, Commander. I'll have that information by 1400 hours. After Rodriguez left, Sarah returned to her intelligence briefings, but her concentration was broken by another knock on the door. This time, her visitor was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thompson, her second in command and the most experienced operator on her team. Marcus was everything a SEAL officer should be: intelligent, deadly, and completely reliable under pressure. He had served with Sarah for 3 years, through missions that had tested their unit in ways most people couldn't imagine. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and absolute trust. "Morning, Skipper," Marcus said, using the informal title that showed both respect and familiarity. "Heard you had some excitement last night." "News travels fast around here," Sarah replied. "Please tell me my team members weren't gossiping about it." Actually, they were more concerned than amused. Petty Officer Jenkins wanted to track down Morrison and have a conversation about respect. I talked him out of it, but barely. This was another complication Sarah didn't need. Her team was fiercely loyal, and they didn't take kindly to anyone disrespecting their commander. Jenkins in particular had a protective streak that sometimes overrode his common sense. "Make sure the team understands that Morrison is off limits," Sarah ordered. "The last thing we need is a series of incidents that draw more attention to our presence here." "Already handled," Marcus assured her. "But there's something else." I've been monitoring communications traffic, and there's been an uptick in chatter about our operation. Nothing specific, but enough to suggest that someone is paying attention. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach, the feeling that came when a mission started to unravel before it had even begun. Operational security was critical for special operations units, and any breach could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. "Source?" she asked. "Unknown at this point." Well, could be routine intelligence gathering by foreign assets, or it could be something more targeted. I've requested additional monitoring from NSA, but you know how long that takes. Sarah did know. Intelligence agencies moved at their own pace, regardless of operational urgency. By the time they provided useful information, it was often too late to matter. Brief the team, she decided. Full operational security protocol starting now. No more casual interactions with base personnel, no discussions of our mission outside secure areas, and everyone needs to be alert for surveillance. Marcus nodded and turned to leave, but Sarah stopped him. One more thing. I want you to do some background checking on PFC Morrison. Find out everything you can about his service record, his associations, and his motivations. I want to know if his curiosity is just wounded pride or something more serious. You think he might be compromised? I think he's a 19-year-old kid who made a mistake and is now trying to save face. But in our business, we can't afford to assume anything. After Marcus left, Sarah spent the next hour reviewing operational plans for the mission that would begin in less than 2 weeks. The target was a suspected terrorist training camp located in a remote area of the Sonoran Desert, approximately 50 miles southeast of Tucson. Intelligence suggested the camp was being used to prepare operatives for attacks on American infrastructure, possibly including nuclear facilities. The mission would require precise coordination between SEAL teams, Marine reconnaissance units, and Air Force special operations. Sarah's role was to lead the initial infiltration, gather intelligence on the camp's defenses, and coordinate the main assault when backup forces arrived. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes operation that had defined her career, but it was also the kind that could go catastrophically wrong if operational security was compromised. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming encrypted message from Naval Special Warfare Command. The text was brief but ominous. Intelligence suggests possible security breach at your location. Initiate Condition Amber protocols immediately. Report status in 6 hours. Condition Amber meant elevated security measures just short of mission abort. It meant that somewhere in the intelligence community, analysts had detected indicators that the operation might be compromised. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with operational alerts, but she forced herself to remain calm and methodical. She immediately sent encrypted messages to her team members calling for an emergency briefing in 1 hour. Then she contacted Master Sergeant Rodriguez, requesting an immediate meeting with the base security officer. Finally, she pulled out a secure laptop and began typing a detailed report on the previous evening's incident with Morrison. As she worked, Sarah reflected on how quickly situations could change in special operations. Yesterday, her biggest concern had been completing training exercises and preparing for the mission. Today, she was dealing with potential security breaches that could compromise months of planning and put lives at risk. The irony wasn't lost on her. A simple confrontation in a mess hall had potentially triggered a chain of events that could affect national security. It was a reminder that in her line of work, there were no small incidents, only events that could spiral into larger problems if not handled properly. Her team members began arriving for the briefing, their faces showing the serious expressions that indicated they understood something significant was happening. Petty Officer First Class David Jenkins was the first to arrive, a 28-year-old demolitions expert whose boyish face concealed one of the most dangerous men in the military. Behind him came Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, a communications specialist whose ability to coordinate complex operations had saved Sarah's team on multiple occasions. The rest of the team filed in over the next few minutes. Petty Officer Second Class Mike Wilson, a sniper whose precision had become legendary within SEAL circles, Petty Officer Third Class Alex Chen, a medic who could perform surgery under fire, and finally, Petty Officer Second Class Tony Brooks, an intelligence specialist who could extract information from sources that others couldn't even find. When everyone was assembled, Sarah activated the electronic countermeasures that would prevent their conversation from being monitored. The small room fell silent except for the quiet hum of jamming equipment. "We have a problem," Sarah began without preamble. "Command believes there may have been a security breach related to our operation. As of right now, we're operating under Condition Amber protocols." The team members exchanged glances, their expressions growing even more serious. They all knew what Condition Amber meant. The mission was still active, but hanging by a thread. "Is this related to last night's incident?" Marcus asked. "Possibly. We're investigating all angles, but the timing suggests a connection." Sarah activated the wall-mounted display and pulled up a map of Camp Pendleton. "Starting immediately, we're implementing enhanced security measures. No one leaves the secure area without authorization. All communications are restricted to encrypted channels, and I want constant surveillance on PFC Morrison and anyone he's been in contact with." Jenkins raised his hand. "Skipper, are we talking about a hostile intelligence operation or just loose lips? We don't know yet, and that's the problem. Until we can determine the source and scope of the potential breach, we have to assume the worst." Sarah highlighted several locations on the base map. "I want two-person teams conducting discrete surveillance on these areas. Look for anything unusual, unfamiliar faces, people taking pictures, communications equipment that doesn't belong." Santos leaned forward. "What about our cover story? Are we maintaining the training exercise narrative? For now, yes, but if anyone asks direct questions about our mission, you refer them to me immediately. No exceptions." Sarah's expression grew even more serious. "I want everyone to understand the stakes here. If our operation is compromised, we're not just talking about mission failure. We're talking about American lives lost and terrorist attacks that could have been prevented." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Each member of the team had volunteered for special operations knowing that their missions often carried enormous consequences, but it never became easier to accept that responsibility. "Chen, I want you to establish medical protocols for emergency extraction. If we need to abort the mission and relocate quickly, I don't want medical supplies or equipment slowing us down." "Roger, Skipper." "Wilson, coordinate with base security on establishing observation posts that can monitor our area without being obvious about it. If someone is watching us, I want to know about it." "Understood." "Brooks, you're going to be our information warfare specialist. I want you monitoring all communications traffic in and out of this base. Look for patterns, anomalies, anything that suggests someone is passing information to unauthorized recipients." "Already on it, Commander. I've been tracking communication patterns since we arrived." Sarah nodded approvingly. Brooks was the kind of operator who anticipated needs before they were expressed. "What have you found?" "Mostly routine traffic, but there's been an increase in encrypted communications over the past 24 hours. Could be coincidental, but the timing is suspicious." "Priority targets?" "I'm working on that. The encryption is military grade, so it's either authorized communications or someone with serious technical capabilities." This information added another layer of concern to an already complex situation. If hostile intelligence operatives were using military-grade encryption, it suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond simple curiosity or accidental security breaches. "All right, people," Sarah concluded. "We've got our assignments. Remember, this mission is still active, but our margin for error just got a lot smaller. I expect everyone to be at the top of their game." As the team members filed out to begin their assignments, Marcus remained behind. His expression showed the concern that came from years of experience in high-stakes operations. "Skipper, I have to ask, do you think Morrison could be working for someone? I know he seems like just a stupid kid, but stupid kids can be recruited." Sarah had been considering the same possibility. It would be naive to assume that terrorist organizations didn't have the capability to recruit assets within the American military. The question was whether Morrison had the intelligence and motivation to serve as an effective operative. "It's possible," she admitted. "But my gut says he's just an immature Marine who made a bad decision and is now trying to save face. The real question is whether his actions have inadvertently created opportunities for actual hostile operatives. Either way, we need to neutralize the threat he represents." "Agreed, but we need to be smart about it. If we come down too hard on Morrison, we risk creating a larger incident that draws even more attention. If we ignore him, we risk letting a potential security breach continue to develop." Marcus considered this for a moment. "What if we gave him something to focus on besides us? Some kind of assignment or responsibility that keeps him busy and makes him feel important? It was an interesting suggestion, and one that appealed to Sarah's preference for solutions that worked with human nature rather than against it. Morrison's behavior seemed motivated by a need for recognition and respect. If they could channel that need in a productive direction, they might be able to neutralize the threat he represented while actually helping his development as a Marine. That might work, Sarah mused, but it would have to be something that feels legitimate to him and his chain of command. We can't just manufacture busy work. Leave that to me, Marcus said with a slight smile. I have some ideas that might interest our young friend while keeping him away from sensitive information. As Sarah prepared for her meeting with the base security officer, she reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that affected military operations. The success of her mission didn't just depend on her team's tactical capabilities. It depended on managing the human factors that could either support or undermine their objectives. The next few hours would be critical in determining whether their operation could continue as planned, or whether they would need to implement contingency plans that no one wanted to consider. The secure conference room in the Base Intelligence Center felt like a different world from the chaotic mess hall where Sarah's troubles had begun. Soundproof walls, encrypted communication systems, and multiple layers of electronic security created an environment where classified information could be discussed without fear of compromise. Sarah sat at the polished conference table, surrounded by the key personnel who would determine the fate of her mission. Colonel James Harrison commanded the Marine base and had overall responsibility for all operations conducted within its boundaries. A 30-year veteran with combat experience spanning 4 decades, Harrison had the kind of weathered competence that came only from leading Marines through impossible situations and bringing them home alive. His presence at this briefing indicated how seriously the potential security breach was being taken. Beside him sat Major Patricia Wong from Base Intelligence. Her laptop open to displays showing communication intercepts and surveillance data collected over the past 24 hours. Wong had a reputation for analytical precision that had made her one of the most sought-after intelligence officers in the Marine Corps. If there were patterns hidden in the data, she would find them. Captain Bradley Stevens represented Naval Intelligence, having arrived on a red-eye flight from San Diego after the security alert was issued. Stevens specialized in counterintelligence operations and had been brought in specifically to assess whether hostile foreign operatives might be involved in the situation. Master Sergeant Rodriguez occupied the chair closest to the door, his role as senior enlisted advisor, giving him insights into the human dynamics that officers sometimes missed. His weathered hands held a thick file containing background information on every Marine who had been in the mess hall during the previous evening's incident. Commander Mitchell, Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of command experience. Brief us on exactly what happened last night, leaving out no details. Sarah provided a precise account of her confrontation with Morrison, including his behavior, his questions, and her response. She spoke in the dispassionate tone that special operations officers used when reporting mission events, focusing on facts rather than emotions. When she finished, Captain Stevens leaned forward. Commander, in your assessment, was Morrison's behavior consistent with someone who had been coached or instructed to make contact with you? It was a question Sarah had been asking herself since receiving the security alert. Morrison's actions could be interpreted as either juvenile stupidity or a deliberately orchestrated incident designed to create an opening for intelligence gathering. Negative, Sarah replied after considering her response. His behavior appeared spontaneous and poorly thought out. If he had been coached, I would have expected more sophisticated questioning and better preparation for my potential responses. Major Wong looked up from her laptop. That assessment is consistent with our analysis of Morrison's communication patterns. We've monitored his phone calls and electronic communications since the incident, and they show someone who is confused and angry rather than someone following predetermined instructions. Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. However, the possibility remains that Morrison's actions, whether intentional or not, have created opportunities for hostile intelligence gathering. What's our assessment of actual compromise? Stevens consulted his own files. Based on the questions Morrison has been asking and the responses he's received, we believe operational details remain secure. However, the mere presence of a SEAL team at this location has now been confirmed to a significant number of personnel who were not previously cleared for that information. This was the crux of the problem. Sarah's mission depended on maintaining cover until the moment of execution. Every additional person who knew about her team's presence increased the risk that information would reach the wrong ears. Recommendations? Harrison asked. Sarah had been preparing for this moment since receiving the security alert. Her answer would determine whether months of planning and preparation would be wasted, whether her team would be reassigned to different operations, and whether the terrorist threat they had been sent to address would continue to develop unchecked. Sir, I recommend we implement a modified operational security protocol, she began. Rather than aborting the mission or relocating my team, we use the attention we've attracted as cover for our actual objectives. The room fell silent as the assembled officers considered this proposal. Using attention as cover was a classic intelligence technique, but it required careful execution to avoid creating additional complications. Stevens raised an eyebrow. Explain your thinking, Commander. Right now, Morrison and others believe they've discovered something significant, a SEAL team conducting unknown operations at a Marine base. Their curiosity is natural and predictable. Instead of trying to suppress that curiosity, we feed it information that supports a cover story while concealing our actual mission. Sarah activated the wall display and pulled up a map showing training areas throughout Southern California. We announced that my team is here as part of a new joint training program designed to improve cooperation between SEALs and Marines. We conduct highly visible training exercises that demonstrate advanced techniques while actually rehearsing elements of our real mission. Major Wong looked intrigued. That would explain your team's presence and capabilities while directing attention away from the actual target area. Exactly. Morrison gets his curiosity satisfied with information that makes him feel important without compromising operational security. Other personnel see training activities that appear completely legitimate, and anyone conducting surveillance on our activities observes exercises that support the cover story. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. It's audacious, Commander, but it could work if executed properly. What would you need from us? Full cooperation from base personnel in maintaining the cover story, permission to conduct training exercises in designated areas, and, most importantly, a way to redirect Morrison's attention that makes him feel valued rather than marginalized. Rodriguez spoke up for the first time during the briefing. I might have a solution for that last part, sir. Morrison's unit is scheduled to participate in advanced combat training next month. If we accelerated that timeline and gave Morrison a leadership role in the training, he'd be too busy and too proud to keep asking questions about the commander's team. It was an elegant solution that appealed to everyone's interests. Morrison would receive additional training and responsibility that would enhance his development as a Marine while keeping him occupied and away from sensitive information. Stevens nodded approvingly. That addresses the human factor, but we still need to consider the possibility of electronic surveillance. If hostile operatives are monitoring our communications, they'll notice changes in our operational patterns. Sarah had anticipated this concern. We've already implemented enhanced electronic security protocols. Additionally, we'll use the cover training exercises to test for surveillance and potentially identify any hostile intelligence assets that might be operating in the area. Major Wong pulled up a different display showing communication intercepts from the previous 24 hours. We have identified several anomalous communication patterns that could indicate surveillance activities. If we proceed with the cover operation, we can use controlled information releases to trace the path of potentially compromised intelligence. The technique Wong was describing was essentially using their own operation as bait to catch hostile intelligence operatives. It was risky, but it could provide valuable information about enemy capabilities and intentions. Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the base training areas. Commander Mitchell, your proposal is approved with the following conditions. First, all training exercises must be coordinated through base operations to ensure they don't interfere with routine activities. Second, you'll provide daily briefings on any intelligence gathered through the cover operation. And third, you'll have 48 hours to demonstrate that this approach is working before we reconsider more drastic alternatives. Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with renewed determination. The mission was still active, but the pressure to prove its viability had increased significantly. Understood, sir. My team will begin implementing the cover operation immediately. Stevens closed his laptop and prepared to leave. Commander, I'll be remaining on base to monitor the counterintelligence aspects of your operation. If we do identify hostile surveillance, I'll coordinate the response with appropriate agencies. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her quarters to find Marcus waiting with updates on the team's surveillance activities. His expression suggested developments that needed immediate attention. "Talk to me," Sarah said, settling into her desk chair. "Brooks identified the source of those encrypted communications," Marcus began. "They're originating from a commercial communications facility in Tijuana, Mexico. The encryption is military grade, but the transmission patterns suggest coordination between multiple assets. This information elevated the threat level significantly. Professional intelligence operatives using sophisticated communications suggested an operation far more complex than simple curiosity about military activities. Are they targeting us specifically, or are we just one of multiple interests? Brooks thinks we're a priority target, but not the only one. The communication patterns suggest a network that's monitoring multiple military installations throughout Southern California." Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The terrorist training camp her team had been sent to investigate might be part of a broader intelligence-gathering operation designed to identify vulnerabilities in American military capabilities. What about Morrison? Any indication he's been contacted by outside parties? Nothing direct, but there's something you should know. His questions about our team haven't been random curiosity. He's been specifically asking about SEAL capabilities, training methods, and operational procedures. That suggests either very focused personal interest or coaching by someone who knows what information would be valuable. This development complicated Sarah's assessment of Morrison's motivations. While his behavior still seemed consistent with wounded pride and juvenile curiosity, the specificity of his questions suggested possibilities that couldn't be ignored. "I want Morrison under discreet surveillance starting immediately," Sarah decided. "Full electronic monitoring of his communications and physical surveillance when he's not on duty. If he's being manipulated by hostile operatives, we need to know before it affects our mission." Marcus nodded and pulled out his encrypted phone to relay instructions to the team. As he worked, Sarah reviewed the files Rodriguez had provided on Morrison's background and service record. Jake Morrison had grown up in Phoenix, Arizona, the youngest of 3 children in a middle-class family. His father worked construction, his mother was a nurse, and both of his older siblings had attended college rather than joining the military. Morrison's decision to enlist had surprised his family, who had expected him to follow a more traditional educational path. His service record showed the typical progression of a young Marine with more enthusiasm than discipline. Multiple counseling sessions for minor infractions, excellent physical fitness scores, and leadership potential that remained largely unrealized due to maturity issues. Nothing in his background suggested connections to foreign intelligence services or extremist organizations, but Sarah had learned through years of special operations that background investigations only revealed what people wanted them to reveal. The most effective intelligence assets were often recruited after they entered military service, when they had access to valuable information, but before they had developed the experience to recognize manipulation attempts. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from Brooks. "Anomalous communication patterns increasing. Recommend immediate implementation of cover operation." Sarah made her decision. The luxury of extended planning was gone. They needed to act immediately to stay ahead of whatever intelligence operation was developing around them. She sent encrypted messages to her entire team. "Execute cover operation beginning tomorrow 0600 hours. Full deployment of Training Scenario Alpha 7. This is not a drill." Training Scenario Alpha 7 was one of several cover operations they had developed for exactly this type of situation. It involved highly visible joint training exercises that would demonstrate SEAL capabilities while actually rehearsing key elements of their real mission. To outside observers, it would appear to be an ambitious training program designed to improve military cooperation. To Sarah's team, it would be final preparation for the most important mission of their careers. As she prepared her equipment for the cover operation, Sarah reflected on how quickly their situation had changed. A simple confrontation in a mess hall had revealed what might be a sophisticated intelligence operation, targeting multiple military installations. Morrison's role remained unclear, but the stakes had risen far beyond a young Marine's wounded pride. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Sarah's team would need to execute a complex deception operation while maintaining readiness for their primary mission. all under the scrutiny of hostile intelligence operatives who might be watching their every move. But this was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes operation that had defined Sarah's career. She had led teams through impossible situations before, and she would do it again. The only question was whether they could maintain their cover long enough to complete their actual mission before their enemies realized they had been deceived. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Rodriguez's voice carried the urgency that indicated significant developments. "Commander, you need to see this immediately. Morrison just received a phone call from someone claiming to be a military journalist interested in writing a story about joint training operations." The conversation lasted 12 minutes, and the caller asked very specific questions about SEAL presence at Camp Pendleton. Sarah felt her blood pressure spike. A military journalist contact was exactly the kind of approach professional intelligence operatives use to gather information from unwitting sources. If Morrison had provided details about her team's presence and capabilities, their operational security might already be compromised beyond repair. "Where is Morrison now?" she asked. "Heading to evening chow. The call ended 10 minutes ago." Sarah grabbed her gear and headed for the door. The cover operation would begin tomorrow as planned, but tonight she needed to have a very different conversation with PFC Jake Morrison. The stakes had just risen beyond anything the young Marine could possibly understand. The evening air at Camp Pendleton carried the familiar sense of diesel fuel and weapon oil that defined military installations worldwide. Sarah moved through the base with purpose. Her mind focused on the critical conversation ahead. Behind her, Marcus and 2 other team members maintained discreet surveillance positions, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. Morrison sat alone at a corner table in the nearly empty mess hall, picking at his dinner while staring at his phone. The cocky confidence he had displayed 2 nights earlier had been replaced by obvious anxiety. Word of his encounter with a SEAL commander had spread throughout the base, bringing him attention he no longer wanted. Sarah approached his table with measured steps, her expression calm but serious. When Morrison looked up and recognized her, his face went pale. "PFC Morrison," she said quietly. "We need to talk." Morrison started to stand, but Sarah gestured for him to remain seated. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he set down his phone. "Ma'am, I already apologized. This isn't about your behavior in the mess hall," Sarah interrupted. "This is about the phone call you received 30 minutes ago." Morrison's eyes widened with surprise and fear. The realization that his communications were being monitored hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "How did you... that was just a military journalist interested in joint training operations," Sarah finished for him. "Tell me about that conversation, Morrison. Every detail." The young Marine's face flushed red as he processed the implications of her knowledge. If they knew about his phone call, what else did they know? And more importantly, what kind of trouble was he in? "He said his name was David Reynolds," Morrison began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He works for Military Times magazine and wanted to write a story about new training programs. He said someone gave him my name as a Marine who might have interesting information." Sarah maintained her calm expression while analyzing this information. Military Times was a legitimate publication, but hostile intelligence operatives frequently used established media outlets as cover for their activities. The fact that Morrison had been specifically targeted suggested a level of sophistication that confirmed her worst fears. What questions did he ask? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wanted to know about unusual training activities, any special operations units that might be visiting the base, and whether I had observed any new techniques or equipment that weren't standard Marine Corps. Each question revealed professional intelligence gathering designed to extract maximum information while appearing routine. Morrison had been expertly manipulated by someone who understood both military culture and human psychology. "What did you tell him?" The silence stretched for several seconds as Morrison wrestled with his conscience. Sarah could see the internal conflict playing out across his face, the desire to cooperate warring with the growing realization that he might have made a serious mistake. "I told him about the SEAL team," Morrison finally admitted. "I said there was a commander who had combat experience and was conducting some kind of training with advanced techniques. I mentioned that the team seemed to have specialized equipment and that their training exercises were different from normal Marine operations. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Morrison had provided enough information to confirm the presence of elite special operations forces at Camp Pendleton, along with details about their capabilities and activities. In the wrong hands, that information could compromise not only her mission but other classified operations as well. Did he ask for specific names or unit designations? Yes, but I didn't know those details. I just knew you were a commander and that your team was Navy SEALs. He seemed really interested when I mentioned that you had put me in that arm lock. He asked several questions about your combat training and physical capabilities. This information painted a picture of professional intelligence gathering designed to assess both unit capabilities and individual operator skills. Whoever David Reynolds really was, he knew exactly what information would be valuable to hostile intelligence services. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had led men through combat operations across 3 continents. Morrison, I'm going to explain something to you, and I need you to listen very carefully. The person you spoke with was not a military journalist. He was an intelligence operative working for people who want to kill Americans. Morrison's face went white as the implications hit him. But he knew about military publications. He had a press ID number. Professional intelligence operatives are trained to impersonate legitimate journalists, government officials, and even military personnel. They study their cover identities for months before making contact with targets. Sarah paused, letting this information sink in. You've been recruited, Morrison. Whether you realized it or not, the young Marine began to shake as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. Tears formed in his eyes as he understood that his desire for recognition and attention had been exploited by enemies of his country.
What happens now? He whispered. Sarah studied Morrison's face, seeing genuine fear and remorse rather than defiance or continued deception. Her assessment was that he was a victim of manipulation rather than a willing collaborator, but that distinction would make little difference if classified information had been compromised. That depends on several factors, she replied. First, you're going to tell me every detail of your conversation with Reynolds. Second, you're going to cooperate fully with counterintelligence personnel who will want to debrief you. And third, you're going to follow my instructions exactly if you want to help fix the damage you've caused. Morrison nodded eagerly, desperate for any chance to make amends. Yes, ma'am, whatever you need. Sarah pulled out her encrypted phone and sent a quick message to Marcus. Bring Stevens to conference room B immediately. Morrison is cooperating. Within 10 minutes, Captain Stevens arrived with recording equipment and began a detailed debriefing of Morrison's conversation with the alleged journalist. The process took nearly 2 hours as Stevens methodically extracted every detail of the communication, cross-referencing Morrison's account with electronic intercepts and known intelligence gathering techniques. When the debriefing concluded, Stevens' expression was grim. Commander, based on the questions asked and the information provided, I believe we're dealing with a sophisticated intelligence operation that has successfully gathered preliminary information about your team's presence and capabilities. Sarah had reached the same conclusion, but hearing it confirmed by a counterintelligence specialist made the situation feel even more serious. Assessment of compromise level? Moderate to severe. They know you're here. They know you're SEALs. And they have some indication of your training activities. However, they don't appear to know your actual mission objectives or timeline. This was better than the worst-case scenario, but it still meant that their operational security had been significantly compromised. The terrorist training camp they were supposed to infiltrate might now be prepared for their arrival, turning a reconnaissance mission into a potential ambush. Sarah made her decision. We proceed with the cover operation as planned, but we accelerate our timeline for the primary mission. If hostile intelligence knows we're here, our window of opportunity is closing rapidly. Stevens nodded agreement. I'll coordinate with NSA to track the communication networks that Reynolds used. If we can identify his handlers, we might be able to feed them disinformation that supports your cover story. Morrison had been sitting silently during this exchange, finally beginning to understand the real consequences of his actions. When Sarah turned back to him, his expression showed a level of maturity that had been completely absent during their first encounter. Commander, he said quietly, how can I help fix this? Sarah studied the young Marine carefully,
His transformation from arrogant bully to genuinely remorseful soldier represented exactly the kind of character development the Marine Corps was designed to foster. More importantly, his cooperation might provide opportunities to turn the intelligence compromise to their advantage. "You're going to help us deceive the people who deceived you," she explained. "Reynolds will almost certainly contact you again looking for additional information. When he does, you're going to provide him with carefully crafted disinformation that supports our cover operation while concealing our real objectives." Morrison's eyes widened as he realized what she was proposing. "You want me to be a double agent? I want you to be a Marine who helps protect his country by correcting the damage caused by his earlier mistakes," Sarah corrected. "The information you'll provide will be prepared by intelligence professionals and designed to mislead our enemies rather than help them." Stevens pulled out a laptop and began typing rapidly. "I can have a disinformation package ready within 6 hours. We'll include details about fake training schedules, fictional operational objectives, and misleading capability assessments that will send hostile intelligence down false trails." Over the next several hours, Sarah's team worked with base intelligence personnel to implement an elaborate deception operation. Morrison would receive coaching on how to provide convincing disinformation while appearing to cooperate with Reynolds' intelligence gathering. Electronic surveillance would monitor all communications to ensure the deception remained credible while protecting classified information. Meanwhile, Sarah accelerated preparations for the real mission. The terrorist training camp would be infiltrated in 5 days rather than the originally planned 2 weeks. Her team would need to complete all remaining preparation while maintaining the cover operation that kept hostile intelligence focused on false objectives. The next morning brought the first test of their deception plan. Reynolds called Morrison exactly as predicted, asking follow-up questions about SEAL training activities and requesting specific details about equipment and personnel numbers. Morrison, coached by counterintelligence specialists, provided carefully prepared responses that suggested a much larger and longer-term training operation than actually existed. The call lasted 18 minutes and was monitored by NSA technicians who traced it to a sophisticated communications network operating across multiple countries. Analysis of the conversation confirmed that Reynolds was indeed a professional intelligence operative, but one who appeared to accept Morrison's disinformation without suspicion. Sarah watched the intercept analysis with growing confidence. The deception operation was working, but success would depend on maintaining the illusion long enough for her team to complete their primary mission. 3 days later, Sarah led her SEAL team on a nighttime helicopter insertion into the Sonoran Desert. Their target was a remote training camp that intelligence had linked to planned terrorist attacks on American nuclear facilities. The mission would determine whether months of preparation and the complex deception operation had been worthwhile. As their helicopter approached the drop zone, Sarah reflected on the unlikely chain of events that had brought them to this point. A simple confrontation in a mess hall had revealed a sophisticated intelligence operation, led to the recruitment of an unwitting Marine as a double agent, and ultimately provided the cover they needed to execute one of the most important missions of her career. The helicopter's crew chief signaled 30 seconds to insertion. Sarah checked her equipment one final time and prepared to lead her team into combat against enemies who thought they had successfully compromised American special operations capabilities. 2 hours later, Sarah's team had successfully infiltrated the terrorist training camp, gathered critical intelligence on planned attacks, and called in airstrikes that eliminated a major threat to American security. The mission succeeded because the terrorists had been deceived by the same intelligence operation that Morrison had inadvertently revealed. When Sarah returned to Camp Pendleton the following morning, she found Morrison waiting in the secure conference room. The young Marine who had once pushed her in a mess hall now stood at attention with the bearing of a soldier who understood the true meaning of service. "Commander," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you for giving me the chance to make things right." Sarah studied Morrison's face, seeing genuine transformation in his eyes. The arrogant teenager had been replaced by a Marine who understood that real strength came from protecting others rather than intimidating them. "You earned that chance through your cooperation and courage, Morrison. The intelligence you helped gather may have saved thousands of lives." Morrison straightened with visible pride, but it was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had contributed to something larger than himself rather than the loud bravado he had displayed earlier. "What happens now, ma'am?"
Sarah smiled slightly the first time Morrison had seen any warmth in her expression. Now you continue developing into the Marine you were always capable of becoming. Master Sergeant Rodriguez has recommended you for accelerated leadership training. If you apply the same dedication to that program that you showed during this operation, you'll make an excellent NCO someday. As Morrison left to begin his new assignment, Sarah reflected on the complex human dynamics that affected even the most critical military operations. Her mission had succeeded not just because of superior training and equipment, but because she had found a way to transform a potential security threat into a valuable asset. The young Marine who had once embodied everything wrong with military culture had become an example of everything right about second chances and personal growth. It was a reminder that beneath the technology and tactics that defined modern warfare, success still depended on understanding and working with human nature rather than against it. Sarah gathered her classified materials and prepared for the debriefing that would analyze every aspect of the successful mission. But she also made a mental note to follow Morrison's progress through his leadership training. The Marine Corps had invested considerable effort in transforming him into a better soldier and person. She wanted to see that investment pay dividends for years to come. The morning sun rose over Camp Pendleton, illuminating another day of training and preparation for the Marines who would defend America's interests around the world. In one small corner of that vast base, a young private first class began leadership training with a new understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than himself. And in a secure conference room, a SEAL commander filed reports on a successful mission that had begun with an argument over dinner rolls and ended with the prevention of terrorist attacks on American soil. Military service, Sarah reflected, was rarely predictable, but it was always human.